Well, welcome to our webinar. We have a little bit of a unique discussion for you today, talking about brand power shifts in building products, pro influence channel shifts. If you've listened to our webinars in the past, usually we talk about forecasts. There's enough change going on that we think we had to spend a little bit of time on a slightly different but super important topic. So before getting into that, just several things to have on your radar. If you're looking for housing data, think extraordinarily granular lot level housing data on which builders and suppliers are delivering units to the market. Please check out Building Product Pro. There will be an opportunity to get a survey afterwards and get a demo of that. If this type of analysis is relevant to the type of things that you deal with, we have a research platform, a subscription research platform that touches all sorts of different things. Our in-depth repair and remodeling forecasts are here. All the work that we did around brand research is going to be here. Also, our channel and pro contractor detail, building products outlook. There's just so much detail there, and it gives you access to our team. If that's useful to you, please be sure to click the survey at the end, and someone will follow up with you. And then just a plug too for our Zonda advisory team. So in addition to the data and the research that we do, we get asked all the time if we can do boutique custom projects, everything from strategy work to M&A support. Of course, we have a great staff with unique resources that can work on that. So if you need that, please be sure to note that at the end, and our group will follow up with you. And there's 3 events that you need to have on your radar coming into 2025. The first is Build to Rent. It'll be in February 3rd and 4th in Texas. What you need to know about this Build to Rent event is that Zonda's built a census of rental data, which is very different than just like an estimate or a survey. It means there's just a huge amount of granular information. So at this event, you'll get some interesting analysis and also great opportunities for connections. Invitation Homes will be there, Pretium, Tricon, so many industry players. You need to be at this event if you're focused on rental housing. Then this one's quite exciting. Accelerate home buying in a digital world. I will be here March 24th through 26th at the Westin Austin in Austin, Texas. This is a pretty exciting event. This is the old revamped DCX event. We're going to be spending time talking about AI-driven marketing, dealing with new home buyers and sellers, shifting consumer and buyer behavior. So much here. So this is worth checking out and getting a sense. It's very different than other events that Zonda's done before and related to our recent BDX acquisition. And then lastly, this event doesn't need much of an introduction, but Builder 100 coming up quickly, May 5th through 7th next year. This is one of the premier events for home builders and for leadership, and I will be there too. So if you'd like to talk more about any of the things we go through, please be sure to put that on your calendar. So today's discussion is not a forecast. We are in the process of sending our forecast to clients. A new one's going to drop this week, but I need to anchor what I'm about to show to you with something that we talk about a lot in our forecast, and that's kind of how much historical change happens versus expectations. So what we have here, of course, is actual housing starts and predicted housing starts, what was consensus forecast years ago. Some of you may have been in the industry during the mid-2000s. And if you remember at that point in time, it was consensus that we knew housing had to come down. You can see the black dots here leading down. The consensus view was that there was some form of activity that needed to moderate. Sometimes people talk about their view during the mid-2000s like it was unusual, like they called the decline. It's useful context that was a pretty mainstream view. It was the degree of decline that caught many unaware. But then this is my point. I entered this industry in October of 2007, and I was in a role for forecasting for building products. And I will never forget these black dots, because the consensus forecast as the great financial crisis began to unwind, of course, centered around housing, was essentially flat. Flat in December 2007 about what was going to happen that year, then flat again in 2008, and then flat again in 2009. And it was not just wrong, but directionally wrong by an order of magnitude. Of course, there had been no precedent in the history of the data for some of the changes that happened. And then you kind of had this question about where growth was going to go once we got to 2010. And then many industry participants and brands that are in the market right now essentially grew up in this kind of blue area here where, consensus forecast was roughly in line with the type of growth that we had. Things were pretty predictable. And then, of course, COVID hit and the industry was shaken up again. We've seen a lot of changes since. And now we're at another pivot point and another change. So we're saying a new forecast to clients this week on this. But the reason for showing this is our message to clients is don't be complacent, especially regarding brands and channel shifts coming into 2025. We think there's a chance in the industry that some participants are caught flat-footed. And we're going to talk about that today. So let's get into our discussion. Here's our summary slide. If you remember nothing else from today, remember this. So we think that there is a making for a potential reshuffling, like a strategic reshuffling of building products leadership. I'm talking about brands and companies and suppliers. That's driven by a combination of how pro contractors and builders are purchasing their products. And we think it's likely to accelerate as the industry shifts to growth ahead. Here's what you have to know. So supply and demand for pro contractors and builders, it was tight in 2021. It's gotten a little bit easier. It will get progressively tighter as the industry shifts from decline, which is where it's at now, to growth ahead. Significantly tighter. Pro influence attached to that over building products in the home, which we call pro veto. Maybe you've had where you knew that a consumer wanted to install your product and then they were talked into another product by a pro who pitched them on something else or just installed what they want. That's going to become more prevalent, we believe. And we've seen this before. This is not new. It's the magnitude that's new. The industry's soft right now. I'm going to show you some data on this. And we think that softness is masking the underlying shift that's happening in pro purchases, including where they're buying. And that especially impacts e-commerce and online purchases. This shift began in 2020 and now it appears to be accelerating again. This is going to hit us right in the nose, we think, later in 2025. And to that point, e-commerce is not new. We're not saying e-commerce is new, but the shift of pro contractors buying and building products online like we're seeing now is absolutely new. That's an important differentiation. So we think that pro purchases are up between 2.6 to 3 times more than they were at pre-COVID. And that totally changes the competitive set of the type of products that are selected from the brands, who wins, who loses. We're going to talk about that. Lastly, we think now is the time that if you are in a position where you influence strategy, brands, decisions for a building product manufacturer, or actually if you're trying to forecast who's going to win, now is the time to really carefully kick the tires on exactly what the strategic roadmap is. So we're going to share some of that data with you here. But this is part of the market that didn't change a lot from 2022 and 2023, but will be changing next year and beyond. So what we're going to do is walk through 4 key sections. We're going to talk about the Complex Pro, which Home Depot and Lowe's have talked about at length, why that's such a key focus coming into the next 5 years. Then we're going to pivot to this shift that's happening by channel of where pros are purchasing their products. And we have some data that we showed 20 months ago, what we're seeing today, and where it's going forward. Then we're going to talk about our brand power ratings. This is a culmination of a whole lot of research, a whole lot of time that our team spent within a few kind of innovative ways of measuring. We found a way to rack and stack the relative performance of building product manufacturers' brands with the pro. And this especially matters as pros change where they go. And then we're going to talk about big strategic questions and some additional data heading into 2025. So let's get started. So let's first of all talk about the Complex Pro. January of this year, Home Depot changed their verbiage slightly, although it was not a change of their strategy. Home Depot began talking about the Complex Pro, which is essentially a pro that touches very complicated varieties of projects. So not just a handyman, but maybe like a home builder, someone who's doing a phased project. And it's striking where the Complex Pro fits in the overall strategy. So this slide is a slide that was featured at Home Depot's Investor Day when their CFO was talking about how to think about their sales outlook during a kind of a relatively stable period. Obviously, right now has not been a stable period. But what we're highlighting here is generally if you were growing a retail business, you would add more stores, maybe do some M&A, and they have that on here. But the real lean in and strategy is an interconnected experience, which is e-commerce, and pro market share. And pro market share is listed twice. Let's not let that be lost on us. So we believe that the battle for the complex pro is kind of the key pivot theme of which who dominates 2025 through 30. That's true for channels. It's also true for the brands. Similar story for Lowe's. So this is Lowe's most recent earnings call. Of course, one of the big call outs was their focus on pro as part of their total home strategy. Notice that of the prepared remarks, Marvin Ellison, their CEO, made the comment that they continue to build momentum with our total home strategy, reflected by our mid-single digit positive comp with the pro customer. It was a tough quarter for Lowe's. It was a tough quarter. We're going to have more results coming out this month, but the focus was on e-commerce and the focus was on the pro. That shouldn't be lost on us. If we remember back about 2 years, do you remember how it felt during that construction labor pinch immediately after COVID when we saw a wave of housing demand and then we just couldn't find workers? How difficult it was to find someone to do an install at your home or a builder to find labor if they even could. So this is a real job listing. This is actually still live, but I think this is interesting to think about the backdrop here. So this is for a plumber. They advertise is that they're making over $100,000 a year, and there's an opportunity to earn a lot more than that. But they're also offering all sorts of benefits that you typically didn't see among the trades: flexible hours, an immediate sign-on bonus, but interestingly, a relocation package, and then all sorts of other paid holidays, vacations. You get to bring your own vehicle home. So what we're generally seeing is that there was a time in 2021 and 2022 when suddenly being able to influence the pro installer, this is for those services business especially, became gold. If you could get the pro and you could get the product, you could almost charge whatever you wanted. And we saw all sorts of building product brands come out and essentially price their products wherever they wanted because there was a supply shortage. So we should remember this because we think we're going to go back to a feeling in 2026 and 2027, and this obviously ties to our forecast, where the labor market may feel pretty similar, but even more pinched. So what's happening and why is this strategic backdrop shifting so much? Well, this is not a fast-moving change, but it is a kind of a slow-moving major pivot that's happening. Several things are occurring. So the underlying population is shifting. You're probably aware of this. Here what we have is the ratio of population age 25 to 64 relative to those who are 65 plus. And you'll see just this, the direction of this chart is just going down, which means from today to 2030, the 65 plus population will grow about 15% faster than everyone else. So why does that matter? Well, a percentage of them will retire, but what we've seen structurally change really since COVID is that the labor participation rate of those older contractors, older construction workers, and not just them, more broadly too, the labor participation rate of 55-year-olds just dropped. There's like a 5% less probability compared to before that any 55-year-old will be in the workforce at all. And if we think about those pro contractors and builders that were over 55, they had a tremendous amount of knowledge. They probably had a lot of brand equity where they knew which brands that they liked working with. They knew the puts and takes of different products. We're seeing that group is the one that's essentially leaving the workforce, aging out, and being replaced by some newer ones that are really learning for the first time new fresh impressions off of different platforms about products and brands. And we think that this shift that's been slowly happening has largely been ignored in 2024, mostly because of how much the market has softened. So I'll just share a bit of data with you. We get a lot of questions around near-term real-time indicators for builders and for remodelers. One of the data points that I love that we point to is the mix of pro contractor bids that were recently rescoped or canceled or pushed back across the table. We call this a pushback ratio. And the idea is Most contractors are not very fastidious about tracking like their cost versus their pricing power, but they really, really, really have a good sense of how strong the orders are coming in, how fast they're being adjusted. So here's what's important. This number was roughly between 1.5 to 1.8. A balanced market would be roughly 1, where about half of your projects that you bid on were either adjusted and half of them were immediately accepted. What we sent to clients about 6 weeks ago was this note. Look at this jump from April to May to June, and then suddenly in July and August, this jump in what's called the pushback ratio from 1.79 to 2.1, and then another August read of 2.1. This is a monster jump in the wrong direction. Significantly softer market. This means pricing power gets more challenged, more canceled projects. We have all sorts of additional detail on like what type of projects these are. And then in September, we saw this improvement, 1.47. That is a great read. That's the best read that we've seen in all of the other data points since 2023. So this is kind of an interesting environment because you have whipsaw happening. So you have kind of this big destocking potentially, you have softness in price points, and then all of a sudden you see a positive read. So what we think has generally been happening this year is there's been so much bearish activity in a soft market that the focus has been on just kind of maintaining the current book of business, but we forget how fast the market can change. So one way of thinking about that too, and again, this isn't a forecast, but it's good to give you a sense of the scale, just in terms of what to expect over the next few years. Here is the spend per square foot on remodeling. And remember how just enormous that market is. Billions and billions and billions of dollars. Home Depot and Lowe's sell to that market. We're talking well above over $450 billion of spending. So on a per square foot basis, which I think is the right way to think about it, basically deflating remodeling spending by the same cost that builders would use, because that's useful for you for comparing pro projects. We can make a couple conclusions about where we are right now. One, right now, coming into Q4, supply and demand for pro labor is artificially low due to all these postponed home improvement projects. So more on this in our forecast, but basically we are as far below historic norms of spending per square foot as we were above historic norms during pre-financial crisis housing boom levels. And so our forecast, although the growth rate has looked pretty aggressively in the past, really, to me, this doesn't look that aggressive because we're just getting back to historic norms. So the timing of this rebound is a focus that we're spending a lot of our time in our upcoming forecast, exactly what quarter and pricing and all those things. But you should be thinking about the level of improvement here. This rebound that we think will happen at latest by 2026 to 30 is going to rebound exactly at the same time as all of those pro contractors are essentially exiting the market and being replaced by a different group. So this really changes the backdrop of supply and demand for all these pro contractors. It's part of the reason that the complex pro is just so important and so strategically valuable coming into 2025 and beyond. And this is the reason that we're seeing, we think, so much investment too around all these suppliers chasing these pro installers. Okay, and here's one more data point, by the way, not to miss this, but this is important for you to be thinking about. We spend a lot of time thinking about what's going to make the next few years different than the last few years. And one of the things that we have to point to is just the underlying change that's occurred among accrued home equity. So the black lines here, of course, are the change in home equity that occurred since 2000. You can see the run up during the early 2000s and then the decline during the financial crisis. The purple bars is the accrued equity growth just since the beginning of 2020. And the amount of incremental equity growth just during that little period, that purple period, is just enormous. Really can't overstate it. If it were to be withdrawn and spent in a year, just to give you a sense of the order of magnitude of the dollars there, it would be equivalent to roughly 40% of US GDP if it were spent in a year. We're not saying that's going to be the case. But essentially, if we have just historic normal levels of cash out refi volume, which is really the one of the indicators that we're watching super closely, and there's some evidence that may have bottomed, like likely 2024 is the bottom for that, then where that leads is really important because what happens is that when home equity is extracted and spent on your home, and we're starting to see this move a tiny bit, but the comp is so low, if you do a home improvement project or if you move and spend anything on your home, you are 2x more likely to hire a pro versus the overall broader market, right? So said another way, one of the things we have not seen over the past few years was this massive wave of home equity dollars being deployed. If that moves forward even a small amount, even historic norms, which we think could be higher because of the amount that's there, all that incrementally tilts the projects towards more pros, and there's not more pros. It's a supply demand imbalance to happen. Here's another one. Not to spend too much time on this, but we have to touch this. Just have you thought about the demographics impact? Homeowners over 65 years old, we just talked about that shift. They're growing 15% faster than every other age group. They're 50% more likely to hire a pro than everyone else. 50%. So you've got all these things coming together, and there's more. We've got way more details on this coming together at the same time. So this is a recipe for a tilt towards more pro improvement projects, especially complicated projects. Some of this is going to show up as new construction. Some of it is going to show as like major pro remodels, but we don't have that many more pros. So it's an imbalance of power. So now let's pivot to, at the same time as that kind of underlying imbalance has happened, pros are changing where they purchase. And this is super important. And we think the point that's been missed probably over the last year or so, and definitely is going to matter a lot coming into next year. So rewind. February 2023, 20 months ago, we sent out this research piece in our Building Products Outlook research where we called out that hardware stores were losing considerable ground. And we track this for builders and we track this for pro contractors versus where pros were shopping the year before. Okay, and basically we called this out. This is a potential loss of market share that is really hard to recoup once you begin to see pro shops elsewhere. Fast forward to today, October 2024, True Value, perhaps you saw this, is being purchased now by a hardware rival. We're thrilled to see them getting acquired, but it's not an easy situation. Obviously, there's layers to these type of situations, but change is afoot. We think in part, this wouldn't have happened in 2021. This wouldn't have happened in 2022. It began to occur after February 2023 when we began to see purchase channel shifts overall, and those dollars went elsewhere. So fast forward to today, what's happening right now? Well, we're seeing a shift now too that we think is just beginning to play out. Here's just one example. This is obviously data everyone has access to, Home Depot and Lowe's in their most recent quarterly report. We're going to find out more this month. But basically the story that we saw for both these retailers in August was relatively weak top-line sales declines. We knew that was going to happen, but mid-single-digit declines for comp sales, except for online sales. Home Depot saw online sales grow 4%, while the overall sales declined by 4%. Lowe's saw online sales grow by almost 3%, while their overall sales declined by 5%. That's an 8% spread. So online is growing 8% faster for those retailers than for their overall sales. And we don't think that's isolated. Actually, Home Depot and Lowe's online sales is just the beginning of the story there. Here's a piece that we sent out to clients a couple of months ago. So this is the same general math that we had shared that was happening with hardware back in 2023. Looking at, here's builders, looking at shifts in consumer loyalty or customer loyalty, as well as penetration. So think of where they're spending their dollars and where they tend to be going. And you can see Home Depot, where you want to be in this graph is in the upper right-hand corner in the green. You can see Home Depot is there, and that's great. But what is even higher to the right of Home Depot is this category that's more broadly defined as online only, no stores. So this could include all sorts of things, Amazon, Build.com. Only we know that Build is owned by Ferguson. But essentially, it's a different type of purchase process. Now,
Hey, Todd.
Yes.
I think the other thing that might be worth adding here is, you talked about the aging out of contractors being replaced by younger ones. We're also seeing the younger contractors, kind of the first digital natives to enter the industry, are much more attuned to online purchase than their older counterparts. So that should really accelerate as we see a lot of these contractors in their 50s, 60s, beyond retire, replaced by young people in their 20s.
Huge point. Absolutely. I think our team was talking about, Matt, do you remember when our team was talking about this shift? And one of the analogies that got described was like, do you remember what it was like on your first day of, say, middle school? Like people thought about what clothes they would wear, like first impressions matter. And so we
Yeah.
have these incoming pro contractors that are kind of getting first impressions very differently, to your point, than maybe the generation before. And so it really does change kind of the strategic backdrop.
Yeah, that's a great point. The customer experience is so much better online with building products than it was 5, 10 years ago too. So they're stepping into a much more sophisticated UI, et cetera.
And my sense too is that sometimes when we talk about shifts online, we we sometimes run into kind of friction and pushback by some of the manufacturers because they talk like pro contractors would never really go online. That was true years ago. We think it's shifting now. I had to share this nugget. So Matt and I were at a conference, uh, at a strategy conference that was historically 100%. This is several weeks ago. So historically 100% focused on by pure play building product companies. So think like, I came from Kohler, those type of companies, the Home Depots and Lowe's and those type of companies and their investors. And so what was striking to me was just looking at the mix of attendees in the audience this year. So fall 2024, for the first time in attending these conferences, uh, Amazon. Amazon was the one who had more attendees than any other company, than anyone else, including like heads of strategy. Let's not let that point be lost on us. That's interesting. So it's a signal that we think there's some underlying shifts that are happening that no one's really giving a whole lot of heartburn to because the overall market's gyrating so much. But when the market heats up, then it really is going to matter a lot. How I would think about the math behind this shift to e-commerce sales of building materials. So we basically saw a really rapid adoption happen over the last 4 years. So the run rate for e-commerce sales for building materials was roughly about 4 billion. Here we have the quarterly detail broken out, obviously not in aggregate, but that's per quarter. Then we saw this increase immediately as COVID happened, and some pro contractors shopped online and shop totally new supplier, even like builders buying windows at retailers. Maybe you heard of this. They never would do that before, but because there was a shortage and the procurement was so good at some of these retailers that we saw some pro contractors basically pivot for one time where they purchased. And then that kind of unwound. Once we got into 2022, they went back to some of the pro dealers and the traditional lumber yards, and we saw that kind of unwind. What's interesting now is we're seeing the price sensitive pro contractors, and Matt's going to touch on this, apparently are continuing to shop online. And we think that what's accelerating now is that shopping process. We saw a quote from that 2023 piece that we had sent out that really struck me, that some of the pro contractors, they were changing where they purchased back when 2023 was first occurring, meaning unwinding those kind of extra activity of purchases from big box retail. They were going back to their traditional channels. And then they said that they were still looking online at the app at the products and prices, even though they weren't buying. So this just means that there's a potential of a faster shuffle back and forth between some of these online providers that we think is going to accelerate. So now what we'll do is let me give you a brief introduction now that with all that backdrop for how we're thinking about the implications. We're going to talk about brand power, and then Matt's going to go into some additional great detail too on what this means for some of the categories. So here's first of all how I think about 2024 spending, and this is going to accelerate going forward. If we think about the universe of call it US building products, and this includes some installed products here, roughly we're looking at a $436 billion market, including MRO. We think of that, there's about 287 billion where involving pros that are actually like purchasing the product. Obviously, this is in consumer prices, so they're making margin on that too. But the dollars are not insignificant. What we think is happening this year, just this year, is about a $13 billion product swap or substitution, where basically, if they did not change at all their channels where they shopped last year, would not have moved, but now because they're going to a different channel this year and starting to shop in different locations, they're being introduced to different products, different channels, and some of them will convert. Some of them will change what they purchase. So how do we know when pro contractors have, we can kind of see the where this is going. We're going to a world where they likely have more influence over products installed. They likely are changing where they're purchasing. We're seeing that already. It's happening right now, and it's going to happen more. When that mix happens, and pros have a choice of what they buy, what did they actually do? What does the math say? This is interesting. So we have some theory, and I'm going to show you the research. So basically, the theory out there is that it used to be that home buyers and homeowners and home shoppers and the pro contractors kind of all work together, and some influence more than others, but they all influence the products that were selected in the home. Uh, some of them were influenced even over the last 10 years with that concept that I talked about of pro veto, where a pro may kind of install the product that they prefer working with, or they even influence the consumer to install what they want. We've touched a number of companies that we worked with that once we dug into their actual data, this in turned to be a much larger problem than originally that they were thinking. This is going to tighten. So as they go online and the pro contractor buys online, what do? Basically, there's two conclusions. And I included a little heart here because I'm thinking about what my daughter would do if it was a text. So they might select their favorite from this myriad of brands and products that they see online. So if you go to Amazon or if you go to homedepot.com or if you go to anyone, you just are exposed to far more products at different price points than you otherwise would be. So you either can choose your favorite, your preferred one, or the one that you're most comfortable with, or you might find an alternative that you've never heard of before. But it's appropriate and it's lower cost and it's fast and it turns out to be great. It's kind of a race to the bottom. Those are kind of the two main hypotheses that have been flushed out. So, and just by an example of like the type of brands that potentially pros, and I'm picking on Amazon here as an extreme case, but obviously, what you run into in some of these categories is brands that most of us are not familiar with at all, even if we've been in the industry, because they're relatively new, but they're low cost. They get good ratings. They can be delivered in a day. So there's some small percentage that will do this race to the bottom. Okay, so what did we do for research? So let me tell you about the brand research that we did. So we undertook this large research project. We used to do this as part of the general brand use study. This was just much, much larger. Over 1,100 brands researched, 63 categories, looking at pro contractors as its own animal, builders as its own animal, architects too. That's not in this presentation. Pages and pages of research per brands. We provided all this to our BPO research clients or by means of a report. What did we find? So I'm going to show you, just to give you some context of what I'm about to show you. So there's a difference between what we're after is pro brand power. Basically, what are the brands that a pro actually chooses when the rubber meets the road and they go buy whatever they want online. And it doesn't have to be just online, but what will a pro who does a veto of their brand into versus a different product, what will they choose? It's different than awareness. So how I would think about pro brand power versus awareness. We did this study where if you think about kind of the universe of different products that any group of pros might prefer, or they might purchase more often, that's kind of their go-to brand. You might visualize kind of the universe of different products that they would purchase as all these pros standing in line before the checkout counter, with the one being in the very front, the one that they actually purchase the most often. So if it's up to the pro, the one in line gets the purchase. We basically did a huge study looking at some really interesting analysis around what happens when you look at changes in brand awareness and forced ranking. And one way of thinking about this, if you have a universe of brands, some of the time, some pros should choose that as their favorite go-to brand. But if it's just random, if a brand is not very powerful, and I'm picking on Trex here, this is not real Trex data. I'm going to show you the real Trex data in a moment. But if a brand wasn't unusually powerful, what you might see is something like what we see here. So many pros might be aware of a brand like Trex. A couple of them might put them in the front of their cart, and they're the ones who they go to. But some other ones might rank them further back, or they actually select different brands when the rubber meets the road. Whereas compare that with this type of change where you have high awareness, but then you also have a large number of pro contractors that when the rubber meets the road, on a ranked order basis, consistently we see them put that in front of other products. So if it's up to them and they have to sort through many, many, many brands at whatever price they're purchasing, we see those brands have unusual power. That's what we were trying to measure. So how I think about the numbers I'm about to show you, we created a very simple index. Please talk to me offline. We can walk you through the math, but it's very exciting. Basically, 100 would be a statistically neutral brand. So normal, doesn't convert more than it should, doesn't capture more than it should. It's also not losing any. 100 would be statistically neutral. If it's above 100, among pro contractors, and that's why this is special, it's elevated brand power. If it's below 100, it obviously would have lower brand power, and maybe they have to use promotions or other tools to capture share. When we took the entire universe of 1,100 brands across their categories and compared them, we did this analysis. Remember, 100 is neutral. This is the distribution that we ran into. So of 1,100 brands studied, pro brand power was extremely skewed, dominated by about the top 250 brands, and really dominated by the top 50 exceptionally strong brands. Now, this matters a whole lot based on who wins once the rubber begins meeting the road and pros began kind of substituting where they're buying, which ones get more premium, who has to give up margin, really big distribution changes. By the way, the shape of this curve, I don't have any slides on this, but this is just useful information for you. If you were to look at some other industries that when they made the shift from in-person to e-commerce, think of like music when it went entirely digital, the shape of this, the distribution of who won and lost, that distribution shifted. And the shape of that distribution looks very, very similar to what we see right here. So you have some exceptionally strong brands. The breakdown of how those brands look is really different. So what we really see here is that some brands maybe performed far better among remodeling contractors, but weaker among builders. So about 86 of those 1,100 brands, that was their case. I'll show you some of the names in a minute. 114 brands did really well among builders, but not so well among remodeling contractors. Then you had this far kind of broader sea of somewhat weaker brands, weaker in the sense that they could be great brands with great products and great teams, but they have to do something extra to attract the pro contractor. So there's a lot of brand ratings out there. Most brand ratings focus on the consumer's perception, which is valuable. What's special here is when the pro has a heavy hand, this gives us a sense of who the pros typically will swap in. There's 151 brands that are in the upper right-hand quadrant where they have scores over 100 among both builders and remodeling contractors. And here's a sense of just a few sample brands. Obviously, we can't fit 1,100 on a scorecard on one page, but it gives you a sense of just how different some categories perform. I'll just pick on a few different categories. So we have Mastic by Plygym in the upper left-hand corner. They do really, really, really well among pro contractors. But we see them doing relatively less well among builders. So depending on the exposure of the market that we see progress in 2025, that could affect their mix of business. We think pro contractors are going to do well. Artisan by James Hardie has a little bit more builder exposure. And obviously James Hardie has their traditional Hardie board has just fantastic exposure across both. But what this means is a really different strategic kind of backdrop for who gets used when. So another way of thinking about this distribution, this is that mix that I showed you, those 50 exceptionally strong brands. Here's what's fascinating. We were able to compare what happens when pro contractors buy in their normal channel versus when they go and buy online. And when they buy online, say if they go to one of these e-commerce sites, what changes? What do they actually put in their cart and buy? And what we found was that if you're one of those top 50 brands, which is really, I mean, that's only the top 5%, or I'm sorry, even less. They're 2x, pros are 2x more likely to choose one of those brands, even though they're exposed to just a multitude of myriad brands at a much, 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 much lower price point. Now, the majority of everyone else ends up going to the lower price point, race to the bottom option. And so we do see a lot of switching that happens. That's part of that $13 billion of churn that we're talking about to these weaker brands. They're not weaker in the sense that they're worse. They're weaker in the sense that they typically have to offer a different incentive, perhaps prices, in order to capture the pro. that is happening. The middle is kind of the group that takes the most pain because it's very hard for them to convert, say the yellow or the green versus the purple or the black. So now, Matt, I'm going to pass it over to you. You've got a bunch of additional insights that we really need to continue thinking through. Go ahead. And I see the screen, but I don't hear you, Matt.
Oh, sorry about that, guys. So good afternoon, everyone. Earlier, Todd shared our quote pushback ratio and the pricing pressure on pro contractors and builders that it represents. Unfortunately, shrinking project pipelines are only adding to that pressure right now. The first thing that's happening is it became relatively worse for pro contractors than builders this summer. You see the lines kind of switching places in June, July. And now they're both near their low point for the year. So ultimately, it means that both pro contractors and builders are ultimately chasing fewer projects. And all it takes is one underpriced bid to really threaten margin on any given job that they're going for. So why does that matter? Well, squeezed builders have a very direct and obvious impact on sales channels. When pros can't control price as well, they turn to cost, and that leads to expanded shopping across more channels. So here we're looking at shopping behaviors for the faucet category. And this chart shows that pro builders are shopping almost all sales channels more frequently for their faucets. Positive net penetration, almost everything is right of the zero in the middle here. In shopping more channels for the same or less product volume in a soft market ultimately leads to dilution and separates the winners. So in this case, both DFM and rural retail are gaining in the faucet race with a hat tilt to Home Depot as well. They're all in that kind of coveted upper right-hand quadrant. And we examined sales channel behavior and share of wallet at the category level because they're so different. You can't take the faucet channel, for example, and assume that it's going to be the same for another one. Here, for example, are lock sets and hardware. So the first thing that we notice is that no sales channels appear in that coveted upper right quadrant, and almost not at all on the left side, other than Menards, kind of right, left of middle there. So this means that almost all channels are getting more shoppers, positive net penetration, yet no one's share of wallet is increasing. This means, really more people are showing up for Thanksgiving and the pumpkin pie is smaller this year. It's just a battle or a bloodbath in lock sets and hardware. Interestingly, Todd, and I didn't even mention this to you yet, I was poking around Amazon earlier today. Lock sets are becoming such a fungible brand that Amazon has put its Basics brand over lock sets. They're actually selling Amazon branded entry door lock sets now, which is pretty amazing and I think helps contribute to this bloodbath. With this category, we might expect brick and mortar hardware stores and rural lifestyle retailers to take share, but even they're losing. And so as we've been calling for a couple of years now, as Todd showed earlier, that the relative winners here are DFM and online-only sales channels. It's been a recurring theme with many building product categories.
So this is mix shift. This is a recipe for just continued pressure and mix shift in 2024. If I read this right, Matt, and it sounds like also a setup as we look for examples of where there's big divergences between product categories, and that's really what I'm hearing is that the building products industry often kind of cycles somewhat similar. We see the industry grow at the same time, and people spend more on their homes, but in the environment like we have right now, we're seeing just a really large divergence between results based on kind of how you'd filter through some of these categories and these channels.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this category and chart in particular is almost a worst case scenario for the manufacturers of lock sets and hardware, because everyone is getting in. And, really only those brands that can really stand out and are sticky and resilient will do well. I mean, when we see Amazon slapping its name on a lock set and going up against Schlage and MTech and other leaders, that's just and at the same time, some builders are really looking to save money. It's a dangerous place for those sort of mid-level brands that you talked about earlier and sort of always take it on the chin. So pros clearly spread their purchases around more amongst the sales channels, right? But less obvious and frankly, potentially greater impact from the job profit squeeze might be on the brands, not necessarily where they're buying them, but the brands, because they have so many more switching options, like we just talked about with the Amazon example. In fact, 72% of builders, when we asked recently, were more willing to try new brands than in the past. Only 3% said they weren't, and it's a very small group that says, I'm going to keep things status quo. So every builder who says, nope, I'm not going to change, 24 say they will, which is really an amazing level of flux. Um, Less shifts among contractors, but still more than 20 to 1, slightly behind 24 to 1. So this is where it's really important to understand the categories, because this isn't a peanut butter spread approach. Some categories behave very, very differently, as Todd's power brand analysis showed. Pros are willing to substitute brands in some much more than they are with others, and that's where I think the reshuffling has a lot of nuance over these next couple of years. And so we're going to take another look at faucets among pro builders. This is a Zonda stickiness analysis. Many of you have seen it before. It plots brand awareness against brand commitment. And so in the faucet category, we see the brands behave in three clusters, basically. Delta and American Standard are in that coveted upper right. Kohler and Moen are in the second group, really thanks to their brand awareness. While they have very high levels of users, they are not as apt to have those users say they use them the most. They're not as sticky with them as they are with Delta and American Standard. And then the other brands are clustered in the lower left, relatively fungible. As Todd said, some strong brands here, some well-known ones, but might need an extra boost of promotion, sale, other types stimuli in order to keep up with when folks are looking to save.
I should make the comment here that we have a lot of data, especially on the new construction side, that allows us to see, and I'm not talking survey-based data, I'm talking like actual data around what type of products are being selected when there's upgrades, say for faucets and some of the other categories. And one of the changes that we're seeing happening coming into Q4, which we didn't put on any slides, but it's good for you to hear the voiceover, is on a year-over-year basis, there are some categories with really big changes in terms of they were getting a lot of upgrades at this time last year when the builders were throwing incentive dollars at homeowners who are kind of taking those dollars and choosing certain product categories, and now that's not happening, or now that home buyer is holding off. So we think that will trickle into kind of big swings around Q4 and Q1 revenue, and obviously much more strategic things later on. But you likely will see big moves, we think, in the industry as a consequence of where these type of things go.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. And we talked about the difference in the way that pros will treat categories, not only on the sales channel side, but on the product side. So now we'll take a look at stickiness among pro builders in decking. Todd just talked about Trex and some very interesting category dynamics that it's driving here. First is that there is one clear winner in composite PVC decking in its Trex, as you saw earlier. Just superior brand awareness, superior commitment levels. And why that matters is when builders are looking to hit a cost requirement, protect, maybe they're sharpening the pencil, looking to cut back to meet a price. This shows they're going to be very hesitant to move off Trex. They're going to, it is a premium decking, priced like a premium decking, but that's still where they're going to look to save their money. They're going to look to do it elsewhere.
Yeah, we don't.
Interestingly, there's no. What's that, Todd?
I was just going to make the comment. So we don't get involved into like the price targets, that type of investor side gain. Apart from trying to understand who's winning and who's gaining share, and it's not lost on us looking at this slide that Trex's results this quarter were just really, really strong versus I think where kind of expectations were. This is part of the reason we think why too, because it's just it's one of the categories that there might be some temporary destocking, but it's really hard to lose pricing power versus say other brands in the same category.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, that's a good clarification. My only point on pricing was that Trex has not earned this spot based on being a low cost player. Definitely not the case versus a lot of them on the lower left there. So thank you. Thanks for that, Todd. And one thing that's really interesting about decking, we've looked at a lot of categories on this dynamic, is that there's no real middle ground. You saw on the last page, Kohler and Moen, we're sort of in this middle ground. Todd described that grouping of brands that you usually see in a category. Not so much decking though. In fact, they have a very fixed fungible set on the bottom left. And surprisingly, this includes Fiberon. Fiberon's the #3 awareness brand in the whole category, but it's being put in the penalty box because it has a 0 brand commitment level. That means that they might have a lot of people that use them sometimes, but in our work, we didn't have any, in our quantitative research, no one was coming back and saying, I use them all the time, which is a major opportunity to really leverage existing awareness and also tighten builder loyalty. You don't want to be in the bottom left. You definitely don't want to be on the left, the kind of the y-axis on the left, because it means you've gotten a 0 for your commitment score. So we try to dig a fair amount deeper and kind of what put you in this, what put a brand on a specific quadrant. Some of our premium reports, we'll look at drivers. We'll go quickly here in the interest of time, but here, for example, we're looking at Zonda brand conversion versus competition. Is one of those interesting ones that kind of levels the playing field on size of your brand and sort of just puts you on a very equivalent metric, I guess. And so you can see here, amongst the 4 really large awareness brands, Delta is pulling through a lot more purchase per distribution point. That's efficiency in distribution, efficiency in marketing. But then we have a brand that you saw was actually on the lower left on the last chart, Jacuzzi, that although it doesn't have a lot of distribution, it actually pulls more sales through point of distribution than any brand. So it's really important to understand when you're in a category, whether you're manufacturing, distributing, or potentially investing, sort of where this brand sits and how powerful it's going to be and what growth opportunities there might be. So we like to look at it from several different angles. And then another thing we find very interesting to look at is how individual categories might differ from all building product categories. And the reason we do that is because that's what the pro is thinking about. They're not fixated on one category like we might be as a manufacturer. They're thinking about, how am I going to buy the thousands of products needed for my job, and how am I going to consolidate those across channels? And so here, for example, you see that among faucet buyers, they're 4 times more likely to buy faucets than the average category at either pure online or also hardware stores. So at a very high performing channel, one that doesn't perform so well, still does very well with the faucet buyer. And then big box is still a go-to channel for, despite not being as highly indexed, it's still a go-to channel, 15-20% more than average. Builders are buying their faucets from big box.
Matt, let me ask you a question on that. Just for our listeners, if they're listeners may or may not be aware of kind of Matt's background, but we're just grateful to be able to have him. So you've spent some time, you were at JP Morgan a number of years, and then you spent some time at kind of the traditional CPG world, which obviously has a whole number of brand substitutions and channel swaps, and then in building products leadership. Can you think of like another scenario where you saw another category that felt like this, where it was really, really skewed, like to this degree, say for online or hardware? Like anything, this feel familiar at all?
I would say this is really, thank you for that, by the way, Todd. This is really kind of going back, but I would say in a very different set of products, we saw this a lot with young families who were first starting to have kids and buying things very differently than families with older kids or no kids or younger adults for that matter. And so we saw a lot of very interesting SKUs here, and this might be one of those charts some people say, well, why does this really matter? It matters a lot to places like the Depot and Lowe's who have been looking at shopping basket ownership for years, and you look at things like known value items, and it's why you'll sell some products at very low margins because if they come in for those, so milk to a grocery store is not unlike roofing shingles to the depot. It's a price that everybody knows, and if you get that price right, it drives an overall image for your store, and it brings people in, and they also buy higher margin items. And so why it matters to pros here, particularly when the market's busy, is that builders and contractors really don't want to be professional shoppers. No surprise there, but they don't want to spend a lot of time out shopping. That is not productive time. That is cost time versus revenue time, right? And so understanding where else your contractor goes, we think is a very important thing. And it's probably retail thinking from other industries just based on our team's background. But Todd, really specifically the only place we see very big SKUs like this, I would say, are in specialist products, skilled trade products, electrical, plumbing, etc. Those you'll see major SKUs, but mainline products like faucets, no, this is quite rare and an important thing for both manufacturers and distributors to understand. I'm going to go to the next page just because we're running out of gas here a little bit. So our subscribers, BPO subscribers, will recognize the chart on the left here. We recently published it. Todd showed it earlier as well. We had to mask out some of the findings here just for confidentiality purposes, but I think you'll still get the point of it. Apologies, a bit of an eye chart, but it basically shows how the brand power competitiveness that Todd illustrated differs significantly across products. And so we're only looking at part of the products that we chart. As Todd said, we chart 63 that we researched closely. I actually put 62 on this page incorrectly. But it's important to know how they stack up. And so we talked about faucets earlier. We talked about lock sets and hardware. We talked about composite PVC decking. Those all fall within sort of that more difficult brand competition. They index from 112 up to 144. So well beyond the average category, as Todd said, which is 100. It's really important to know sort of where your category falls here. And then here are the other categories in that purple and yellow kind of coveted groupings. They're just alphabetized here, but it kind of shows, sort of how they're all over 100, so they are all above average competitiveness. But some are up at 160 and some are down at 101, and that spells very different levels of stickiness, resilience, pricing power, etc. So we would love to talk about any other that you're interested in here. We just had time to kind of illustrate a few today. So with Todd, I'll hand that back to you. I know you've got some more.
Yeah. Please do stick around here too and take our survey at the end. But just to give you our summary. So again, this is a little bit of a unique backdrop. So we believe that the conditions are set for a potential reshuffling of building product competitors, including channels, because of how pro contractors and builders are changing where they purchase and the relative market power that they have. So supply and demand for pro contractors will get progressively tighter as the industry shifts from a decline right now to growth ahead. We expect to see pro veto increase more over the next 5 years, which basically means pros have more influence in the products that get selected. As part of that soft market right now, that's masking the shift that's already happening. It's happening in data that we're seeing on POS. It's also happening within data that we're seeing among like where pros are going. It's going to accelerate once the market begins to turn. And again, the key here is that e-commerce is not new, but what is new is the shift of pro contractors buying products online. So think of like 2 to 3x more than pre-COVID levels. So now is the time to not be complacent. So please take our survey at the very end. Tell us what would be interesting to you. And if you have any questions, reach out to us too. You have our emails at the front of the deck. Thank you for joining us. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.